Hello and welcome to Chapter 35 of the American Pageant for AP U.S. History or regular U.S. History or dual enrollment U.S. History, whatever you want to do. We're looking at Chapter 35 today, America and World War II, 1941 to 1947. We're going to be doing the Allies' trade space for time through holding the home front. Primarily, we're going to look at the home front of World War II before getting into the major battles and engagement. So Pearl Harbor has happened. America, which was partially engaged in the war by fighting the Germans on the high seas and trading directly with the British and the land lease and all that, now officially was in the war. So the United States had to be the arsenal of democracy, as Franklin Roosevelt called it. They had the task, the daunting task of having to feed, clothe, supply, and transport its forces all over the world, not only its own forces, but the other forces of the Allies. In early 1942, 26 Allied nations met together and vowed to defeat the Axis powers. In fact, they called upon unconditional surrender of the Axis, which kind of paints them into some corners towards the end of the war that they were not willing to negotiate with anybody, even if the Nazi government was toppled, until the unconditional surrender of the Germans or the Nazis, or the Axis, occurred. The idea was that Europe was in more of a perilous situation. They're going to focus on Hitler first. Now, it's kind of ironic that Germany in World War I was so obsessed with avoiding the two-front war. You had the Schlieffen Plan, which, they tried to take out France in 42 days, so then they could move their forces and take out the Russians. The United States is going to do this. They're going to fight two separate wars halfway around the globe. And predominantly speaking, and there's a few exceptions, but their armies largely in charge of fighting in Europe and North Africa. The Marines are being sent to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. What army men or army soldiers or divisions were in the Pacific still stayed and fought. The Navy went both ways, and all those divisions back then have their own Air Corps. There's no Air Force created. That's in 1948. This is a part of the ABC-1 agreement, and a part of this, which Stalin was adamant and vehement through his ministers, that he wanted a second front opened in France immediately and as soon as possible. And so part of this agreement, they agreed that by July 1st, 1943, the Allies would invade France and open up a second front in Europe, which is a daunting task. We're talking about maybe about 18 months to get millions of men trained, supplied, get things built, get them shipped, get them transported, and ready to invade France without any battle experience. It's really a lofty goal, one that the U.S. and Britain are not going to uphold, which really upset Stalin. The United States, they think that in Europe alone, they're going to need 215 divisions of men. A division is 20,000, so that's about 4.3 million men just for this initial engagement in France. And they're also estimating that the U.S. alone is going to need 40 billion rounds of ammunition. So after Pearl Harbor, there's incredible national unity. It sped up the assimilation of immigrants. You don't have the anti-German sentiment like you did in World War I. They're not renaming Liberty or sauerkraut into Liberty cabbage. They're not banning German from schools. There's no government witch hunting of minority groups in World War II, with one major glaring exception, one huge black eye in American history: the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans, mainly on the West Coast. They were forced to live in internment camps, which is a euphemism for concentration camps. 2/3 of these people that were rounded up in a matter of days or weeks were Nisei, meaning they were born in the United States. They were born, natural-born American citizens. This is all through Executive Order 9066 that Franklin Roosevelt signed. There was a lot of fear of sabotage, saboteurs for Japan in case of an invasion. After Pearl Harbor, there was fears of an invasion of the mainland of the United States. One or two-man subs were found off the coast of California immediately following Pearl Harbor, and so there was this huge fear and panic that the Japanese were going to be a part of this, even though they were loyal, and most of them were born here in the United States. The Supreme Court actually upheld this, these use of camps in Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. And so the Japanese, when they left, their houses were ransacked. They were vandalized. They had squatters. They were looted. And in 1945, when the camps were closed and they came home, this is often what they found, was things like this. All their possessions were gone. They could only take what they could carry. This sentiment isn't something new after Pearl Harbor. This is a picture from 1923. And it's titled Campaign Against Japanese. This is in Hollywood in 1923. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. She looks like a very pleasant lady that probably don't want to hang out with. I'm just being funny. These are Japanese American evacuees in 1942 trying to grab their belongings and move into camps. These are 3 boys at Manzanar. This photo is by Toyo Mayataki. I hope I pronounced that right. Which is ironic. In the land of the free, you have these 3 boys gazing out behind barbed wire. Because they weren't trusted simply because who they were. You get a lot of anti-Japanese propaganda. Stop him and the job's done. This is a caricature, a very racist cartoon of a Japanese person. Go ahead, please take day off, which is sponsored by Texaco. That's pleasant. Even though they were not trusted to live freely and work freely, they were trusted to serve in the military. But they weren't trusted to go fight in the Pacific for fear that they would join their ancestors or their brethren or whatever you want to call it. They were sent to Europe to kill Nazis. And so the 442nd Infantry fought in Europe, and they won 21 Congressional Medals of Honor. In fact, they're called the Purple Heart Brigade, or Battalion, excuse me. They are the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Their people, their family members, their husbands, their wives, their fathers, their mothers, their children, forced to live in camps, and these men went off and fought, and are the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. That's in all wars. It's just incredible. Our U.S. government officially apologized in 1984 to the Japanese people who went through this and offered a cash reward or reparation payment, I believe, of I think it's actually $20,000 to any survivors of this. And so the government has tried to make it better, but it doesn't erase this ugly stain from history. So the War Production Board, trying to get the production, everything going to build all this stuff. They had to convert from industry to war. Very similar to what happened in World War I, is these factories, instead of making consumer goods, are going to be making wartime material. And so they oversee, car manufacturers building tanks and planes and things like that. Clothing manufacturers making uniforms. You can go down the list. In fact, you can't. It's virtually impossible. It is impossible. They didn't make 1942, 43, 44, or 45 cars. Maybe a couple left over from 42 because they were still in production in 41. But there's no such thing as a 43 Chevy or a 44 Ford. It doesn't exist. You have the Office of Price Administration. With this influx of government cash from all these government contracts and people going back to work, prices are going up. And so the Office of Price Administration kept prices down to keep inflation in check. You have the National War Labor Board, which kept workers working. This is the 4 freedoms that Roosevelt talked about in one of his speeches about World War II, was that everyone in the world had the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom of want, and freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And these 4 freedoms that was talked about here, this is illustrated by Norman Rockwell, a very famous kind of poster painting of his 4 freedoms. So in all, the U.S. factories built 70,000 ships, 100,000 tanks, 100,000 airplanes, millions of guns, billions of rounds of ammunition. Everybody in this country, every single person made sacrifices. Of course, the separation of loved ones. There's over 15 million people who served in World War II. So you have husbands, you have fathers, you have wives, you have mothers, you have brothers and sisters separated, sacrificing their, not always their lives, but their time and their, being with their relationships. There's shortages of products because of rationing. There are mandatory rationing in this country. There's no cars being made. Nylons. Women complained to high heaven about not being able to get pantyhose because all the nylon was being used for parachutes. And then certain goods of food. So they ration based on your need, based on your how big your family was and how important you were to the cause. You got so many rations in your ration book. And so when you went to the store, you had to pay money, but then you had to pay with these ration coupons, which were perforated and you tear off. And they published every few weeks, every month or so, how many rations it cost for an apple and for a can of beans. And, I don't know, for gasoline, there was gas rations and all this. And so people really had a hard time, especially in farming communities. They didn't get enough sugar. Not that they were like addicted and they ate cakes, but they used the sugar to can their local, their food as they grew, and that was how they preserved their harvest throughout the year, was canning. And so there was always a big worry in rural areas that they wouldn't have enough sugar to can all their goods. So you had to give your ration coupons and your money to buy the goods. They rationed gasoline, shoes, tires, sugar, meat. Sugar was heavily rationed because they wanted to make sure that every soldier had cigarettes and every soldier had candy bars. A little slice of home, a little bit of sweet Kind of remind you of being back home as a kid. Many soldiers didn't really care for the candy bars, and so they handed them out to kids all through Europe and Asia. And so this is actually a thing called candy bar diplomacy, where some people, their first image of an American, in this bombed out city in France, for example, they're scared, and there's this big, large man in an army uniform and a helmet, and they're scared, and the man hands a candy bar, and it just lightens up the people. And it changes their perspective of Americans. As a kid, candy's important. I mean, remember how much you liked Halloween. So here's some local newspapers from where I'm from in western Colorado that shows kind of the ration, the point values. This was effective March 1st, 1943. You can see up here that apples, they're 1, 3, depending how many you've got, and different brands. This is a ration book from a former student of mine, his grandma, actually, and then another one here. Kind of interesting to see these, and they're still pretty neat artifacts. This is the Victory Binding of American Woman's Cookbook on how to cook without certain products. This one was here, recipes to match your sugar ration, so you didn't make sure you went over. These are courtesy of the World War II National Museum, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. So thousands of workers, during the Depression, they were trying to send people out of the countries. During the war, they need workers desperately, and so thousands of Mexican agricultural workers and these Bracero programs were brought into work. In all, like I said, 15 million people served in the armed forces. You have 216,000 women who served in World War II in auxiliary roles. You have the WWII, which is the Women's Army Air Corps. You have the WAVES, which is the Navy. You have the SPARS, which is the Coast Guard. Millions of women took jobs in factories and still worked hard at home. And so women actually did a lot of the flying here in this country. Some women became pilots. They weren't going to be flying combat missions, but they did things flying back and forth in the country. There's a lot of great stories. If you want to look into that a little more. These are some of the famous propaganda posters. Women workers. In all, 6 million women went and worked in the factories, 3 million of which had never worked before. And so you have this girl, the girl he left behind is still behind him. She's a woman ordnance worker, building guns. And then this is the very famous Norman Rockwell portrait of Rosie the Riveter. We know her name's Rosie from the lunchbox, and this is a riveting gun, which riveting was very, very physical, demanding, difficult work to do. When they attach the plates on airplanes, they have to be riveted. They can't have any lip or any amount of the rivet actually sticking out because of aerodynamics. Her face shield is up, looking like a halo, and of course, she's got her foot on Mein Kampf because she's a true blue American. Great painting. There's some women working on an airplane. Very famous war production board picture, painting, or poster, whatever you want to call it, of We Can Do It. And so this idea of women in the workplace has been perpetuated throughout history. And this is from Professor Kennedy himself, the author of The American Pageant and the Pulitzer Prize winning book Freedom from Fear. And so if you look at it, American women didn't work in the large numbers that we would think. Women did earn less, and most lost their jobs at the end of the war. So they didn't get paid as much as men. And when the men came home, they lost their jobs. Most women did not work for wages during the war. If you look at the percentages, if you look at the actual statistics, most women still stayed at home. And this trend of women in the workplace is kind of a later 20th century thing. Most women did not work in industrial jobs. Most women did not work in the 1940s. But it's this, feel-good story that's been perpetuated by teachers and by books and by, professors all through the country. So what really happened is only 15% of married women actually worked. Married women had a duty at home. 9% of mothers with kids under 6 were working. And back then, there's not a lot of daycare opportunities. There's not big daycare centers like they're going on today. If you look at 1944, this is pre-war 1940. And so you jump into the middle of the war, it's only a 4% increase of married women working. And then, 9 to 12 is only a 3% increase of women working with kids under the age of 6. A Gallup poll in 1943 asked women what they wanted to do after the war. These are under 25-year-old women, very young women you'd think would be in the workplace. 75% wanted to be a housewife. That was what society still said women should be doing at the time. Whether or not you agree with that or not, that was their culture, that was their society. Times have changed, and we know now that women can work and fully capable of raising a house on their own. 7% wanted to remain single and have a career. 19% said that they would do both. 80% preferred a housewife if they had to choose between a career and being a housewife. In reality, the 1940, the women's labor force was 30% of our country. By 44, it's only 37%, which is still a big increase. Don't get me wrong. But when you compare it to other nations that are more perilous in terms of what's going on in the fighting, like the Soviet Union and Great Britain, there is no comparison. In 1947, that number went back down to 28%. With the return of prosperity and return of men from the war, women went back to living in the home. In the United Kingdom, the USSR, 70% of women were in the workforce. Women were drafted in the USSR into the workforce. They were forced to go work. The U.S. used propaganda to kind of urge women to do their work and to try to get everybody on board to do their part. And it's still, I don't want to undercut, and Professor Kennedy, who came up with these figures and these statistics, doesn't want to undercut this notion too. But the facts are there that, yes, women did their part, but not in the large numbers that is portrayed in the media and other places as well. So other things going on. We have migrations. We have a shifting of population because of the war. Many African Americans are moving to the north and the west for work. This is a continuation of the Great Migration from World War I. They're really escaping Jim Crow laws. Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Commission after A. Philip Randolph and some of his group threatened to march on Washington in the 40s. They wanted equal pay, and they didn't want that civil rights demonstration for the war, and so Roosevelt quietly took care of things. And this idea of a march on Washington to bring attention to injustice, kind of the seed was planted, and it's going to come back later on. You have the Double V campaign. You have the Tuskegee Airmen. For African Americans, they fought for victory abroad and victory at home. Basically, let's go defeat fascism and hatred in the foreign soil, and then also let's get rid of racism in this nation. You have the famed Tuskegee Airmen, who proved that African Americans were capable of flying missions and serving valiantly and doing well. During World War II, FDR gave the South a disproportionate share of defense contracts to help it become more economically developed. There's more bases in the South. There's more factories in the South to try to help it out. Many African Americans who joined the military went to the South during the war and experienced Jim Crow for the first time. In fact, Jackie Robinson, the future baseball player and famed four-sport Letterman athlete from UCLA, was arrested during the war for refusing to give up his bus seat on a military bus. And so long before Rosa Parks, not diminishing Rosa Parks and what she did, but it did happen during the war. In 1940, of the invention of the mechanical cotton picker, which made the need for cheap labor disappear. As a result, millions and millions of more African Americans are moving to the north. Thousands of Native Americans are also serving the armed forces. You have the Comanche, who are serving in Europe, and the Navajo, the famed wind talkers, serving the Pacific, contributing as code talkers. So here's the big migration out of the South into the West, and then into the North. And so you do have a big, there's 980,000 Northerners who moved to the South for government contracts. You have a huge gain of population for African Americans, particularly in Los Angeles during this war, because of the airline industry. There's some code talkers in 1943. This is from Opportunity Magazine, The Journey of the Negro Life, saying, "Let Henry go." That basically African Americans are becoming more militant and more outspoken and vocal against racial prejudice, and they're ready to break out. And so financing the war, the United States spent $320 billion. The Revenue Act of 1942 raised taxes to pay for it. It also, for the first time, approved withholding taxes from your paychecks. It used to be you got paid, you had to set aside the money for Uncle Sam and yourself, and you had to be disciplined and not just go spend it on tacos or churros or something that are really delicious. The national debt rose from $49 billion. It was pretty high from the Great Depression, but then it skyrockets to $259 billion by the end of the war. The U.S. sold war bonds, and so this is like a temporary loan. People would give, like a savings bond, you would pay for it, and then the government would use that money to finance the war, and eventually it would be paid back with interest. This is an advertisement here. Don't let the shadow touch them. Buy war bonds. That little dolly needs to be thrown away. It's been touched by a swastika. The United States economy grows everywhere. Unemployment virtually vanishes, and the production and the contract and all the money being infused, the Great Depression is long gone. The civilian sector grew by 15% during this time. And one thing that Professor Kennedy has mentioned that's really remarkable, they did Macy's in New York did a December 7th, a Pearl Harbor anniversary sale, which was, this is in the height of the war, 1944. This is months after D-Day. It's the most lucrative day in the history of the corporation. which is just remarkable. It just shows the United States how economically viable it was. It is the arsenal of democracy. You have all this stuff going on. You have 15 million people serving, and yet Macy's has the record day for Christmas, December 7th, 1944. To help the war effort, people got involved themselves. They planted victory gardens. Kids collected scrap metal. They recycled. They did carpooling or car sharing to save energy back then. And then some people served in civil defense. And so to man the skies against the threat of a Japanese or German invasion, people would volunteer several days a week to go defend the home front. And so they gave them these helmets. This is myself, my great-grandma Eva, and my brother here. We were cleaning out her garage and we found some of my grandfather's old civil defense helmets. And she's a sweet old Italian lady. She's pretty short. My brother and I are pretty tall, so don't think that it's kind of a weird picture there. In coastal cities, for fear of bombing, there's blackouts going on. And you have the Office of War Information promoting patriotism. I have a separate propaganda PowerPoint. If you look on my website, if you search Harvey and Coleridge, or Harvey for president, actually, vote for me in 2032, you can find it, and it's in there under the AP US History page. I collected hundreds of posters from World War II for you to look at. There's films, there's posters, there's music, there's movies. If you get a chance, watch Donald Duck's The Fuhrer's Face on YouTube. It's wonderful. You won't find it on Disney+. That's all I got. That was a lot. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, let me know.